For nearly 4 decades, nothing in the Soviet Union was more feared or more powerful than the KGB. 500,000 officers, millions of informers, and a single iron command, all watching, listening, controlling every breath of daily life. In 1991, that entire system, one of the largest state security organizations the world has ever seen, collapsed almost overnight. But it didn't simply vanish. Instead, the secrets, files, and people scattered into the shadows, shaping the new Russia and beyond in ways most of us still don't realize. What happened to the KGB after the fall of the USSR? To answer that, we have to start at the height of its power and trace the fault lines that would soon split an empire open. In March 1954, a secret decree from the Soviet Council of Ministers created the Committee for State Security, better known as the KGB. Its headquarters stood at Lubyanka Square, but its reach extended into every corner of Soviet life. The KGB's official mandate spelled out 5 roles: intelligence gathering abroad, counterintelligence at home, guarding the state border, protecting political leaders, and suppressing internal dissent. Each role was more than a job description. It was a blueprint for controlling a vast, restless empire. Surveillance became routine. Every letter, every phone call, every gathering could be watched or recorded. The KGB's network of officers and informers numbered in the millions, making it one of the largest security apparatuses in history. Its power came not just from the law, but from fear and secrecy. The agency reported directly to the highest levels of the Communist Party, with loyalty to the state considered absolute. Over time, the KGB's influence bled into politics, culture, science, and industry. It could decide who rose and who fell, who spoke and who vanished. The 1954 decree gave it sweeping authority, but the real story was in how the KGB used that authority to shape the Soviet Union from within, setting the stage for both its dominance and the cracks that would eventually appear beneath the surface. Lubyanka Square sits at the heart of Moscow, its stone facade looming over the city like a warning. For decades, the building itself became a symbol of power, of secrecy, of the silent fear that threaded through Soviet life. The KGB's headquarters wasn't just an office. It was the nerve center of a system that watched, listened, and remembered. From the outside, Lubyanka's walls held the weight of 1,000 whispered rumors. Inside, decisions shaped the fate of millions. Every citizen knew its address. Children walked past with their parents, glancing up at the rows of windows. Some said you could be summoned for a conversation and never come out again. The shadow of Lubyanka stretched far beyond Moscow, into every workplace, school, and neighborhood. Its reach was strengthened by the KGB's deep ties to the Communist Party. Promotions, privileges, even the right to travel. These could depend on a single file in an office on Lubyanka Square. The building's presence was a constant reminder. The party and its protectors saw everything. Even as the Soviet Union modernized, Lubyanka's reputation grew. It stood as both fortress and symbol, its very stones soaked in the stories of those who entered and the many who never returned. In the final years, that sense of omnipresence only deepened as cracks in the system began to show. But the building itself remained silent and watchful. On August 18, 1991, Vladimir Kryuchkov and a handful of senior officials gathered in secret to set their plan in motion. The air in the KGB guest house was thick with urgency. By nightfall, the lines to Mikhail Gorbachev's dacha in Crimea were cut. Kryuchkov, Defense Minister Yazov, and their allies demanded the president declare a state of emergency. Gorbachev refused. The next morning, Moscow woke to armored vehicles on its boulevards, and a trembling Gennady Yanev announcing on television that Gorbachev was ill. Tanks rolled toward the Russian White House. Orders went out to elite KGB units, Alpha Group and Wimpel, to prepare to storm the parliament and end the standoff by force if needed. But the city did not freeze in fear. Crowds surged into the streets, defying curfew, stacking makeshift barricades and climbing onto tanks. Boris Yeltsin's voice echoed from the steps of the parliament, calling for resistance. Western reporters broadcast the chaos live, and the world watched. Inside Alpha Group's command post, officers weighed their orders. The memory of Tbilisi, and where security forces had killed protesters 2 years earlier, hung over every conversation. Commanders hesitated, then refused outright. No one wanted to be responsible for Russian blood. The chain of command fractured. Khrushchev's calls grew more desperate, but lines of communication broke down, and military units defected or stood down. By August 21st, the plot had unraveled. Troops withdrew from Moscow. The coup collapsed. Khrushchev and his co-conspirators were arrested before noon. The KGB's authority, once absolute, had been shattered by the refusal of its own elite to carry out violent orders, and by the defiance of a city that refused to be cowed. On August 22, 1991, a crowd gathered in Lubyanka Square. They circled the statue of Felix Dzerzhinsky, the iron-faced founder of the Soviet secret police. For years, he had stood watch over Moscow, granite and unyielding, a monument to fear and obedience. By afternoon, ropes snaked around his shoulders. Engines strained. The statue toppled, crashing to the ground as cheers erupted. In that instant, the old order lost its face. Dzerzhinsky's fall was more than vandalism. It was a public reckoning, a city's verdict on decades of surveillance and silence. Inside the KGB's headquarters, Vadim Bakatin faced a different reckoning. Days earlier, he had been named chairman, handed the impossible task of dismantling the very machine he had inherited. Bakatin moved quickly. He purged officials tied to the failed coup, called for openness, and began splitting the KGB into fragments. Foreign intelligence, border guards, communications, each stripped of the old political police powers. In a move that stunned his peers, Bakatin summoned the U.S. ambassador and handed over blueprints that revealed every Soviet bug in the new American embassy. It was an act of transparency unheard of in KGB history, a signal to the world that the agency's era of secrets was ending. The decisive blow came on October 24, 1991. President Mikhail Gorbachev signed Decree No. UP-2757, abolishing the Committee for State Security of the USSR. The KGB, once the backbone of Soviet power, no longer existed in law. Its offices, files, and personnel would scatter into new agencies, but the institution itself was finished. The break was final, irreversible. On the streets, the fallen statue gathered dust. Behind Lubyanka's doors, the silence was different now. The agency that had watched a nation for nearly 4 decades was itself consigned to history, its symbols shattered, and its authority dissolved. Within weeks of the KGB's legal abolition, a new alphabet soup of agencies began to take shape across the former Soviet Union. In Russia, the job of foreign intelligence passed to the SVR, the Foreign Intelligence Service, while domestic security responsibilities were handed to a series of short-lived bodies. First came the Inter-Republican Security Service, then the Federal Security Agency. Each one inherited offices, files, and personnel from the KGB, but their names changed as quickly as the political winds. By January 1992, President Yeltsin signed a decree creating the Ministry of Security, folding in the old structures under a new banner. The ministry itself would last less than 2 years. In December 1993, it was reorganized as the Federal Counterintelligence Service. And finally, in April 1995, the FSB, the Federal Security Service, emerged as the main domestic successor. The SVR, meanwhile, was formally established in December 1991, continuing the KGB's tradition of global espionage, but now answering to the Russian president instead of the Communist Party. Signals intelligence, once the KGB's domain, went to FAPSI, and border security became the job of the Federal Border Service. VIP protection moved to the newly formed Federal Protection Service. Each agency took a piece of the old machinery, but duplication was carefully avoided. The split was designed to prevent any single body from wielding the same sweeping powers the KGB once held. Yet, for all the new names and shifting mandates, the essential functions, spying abroad, countering threats at home, guarding the country's secrets, remained deeply familiar. The era of the KG had ended, but its core responsibilities found new homes almost overnight. Old habits don't vanish with a signature. The men and women who had filled the ranks of the KGB, border guards, bodyguards, analysts, and field officers, remained at their posts, now wearing new badges, but performing familiar duties. Across Russia, the Federal Border Service took over the long frontiers. patrolling thousands of kilometers from the Baltic to the Pacific. The Federal Protection Service, or FSO, inherited the job of shielding political leaders, maintaining the same protocols, and often the same personnel who once watched over the Politburo. In 2003, the lines blurred even further. The Federal Border Service was merged into the FSB, bringing border control back under the authority of Russia's main security agency. The FSO, meanwhile, continued to operate as a separate force, responsible for the president's safety and the security of key government sites. These agencies became fixtures of the new Russian state, their offices filled with veterans who had spent their careers in the shadow of Lubyanka. Staff retention was more than a matter of convenience. It gave the new agencies a sense of momentum, a living memory of procedures, contacts, and methods. The machinery of surveillance and protection, once built for the Soviet system, kept running, sometimes with only the names on the doors changed. In the provinces, the same faces appeared in regional offices, handling local threats and border crossings, as they always had. The KGB's dissolution scattered its functions, but the people who carried them out remained, shaping the future of Russian security from behind familiar desks. Across the former Soviet Union, the fate of the KGB took on new shapes, sometimes familiar, sometimes unrecognizable. In Belarus, the old name never left the door. The KGB of Belarus still operates under its Soviet-era title. Its methods barely changed. Political opponents vanish into custody, and street protests are met with the same quiet force that once kept an empire in line. Alexander Lukashenko's government leans on these tactics, using the agency as an instrument of control. For many Belarusians, the initials KGB still mean fear. In the Baltics, the story runs in the opposite direction. Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania tore out the roots of the old security state. They opened archives, exposed informers, and turned former KGB buildings into museums. Latvia's corner house, once a place of interrogations, now stands as a warning. Documents are open to the public, and the agencies that replaced the KGB, like Estonia's KAPO, operate under parliamentary oversight, with Western advisors shaping their practices. In these capitals, transparency became a shield against the return of old ghosts. Ukraine's path twisted between these extremes. The SBU, or Security Service of Ukraine, inherited KGB staff and files after independence. For years, old habits lingered, but the Maidan protests in 2014 forced a reckoning. As new leaders took charge, the SBU purged senior officers tied to Moscow, opened parts of its archives, and invited foreign experts to help with reform. The process remains incomplete, but the push for openness set Ukraine apart from its neighbors to the east. Kazakhstan offers another variation. The KNB, Committee for National Security, blended Soviet techniques with a focus on local threats. Here, the agency's role is less visible but just as central, balancing between loyalty to the president and the demands of a new nation. Each successor state faced the same question: what to keep, what to discard. The answers, written in policy and in memory, still echo in the region's politics today. Shadows from the KGB's past reach into the present, sometimes in ways that feel ripped from the pages of a Cold War novel. In June 2010, a quiet suburb in New Jersey became the scene of an international drama. FBI agents moved in and arrested 10 people, neighbors, parents, employees, accused of being Russian sleeper agents. The so-called illegals program had operated for years, its members living under false identities, gathering information, and building networks just as their Soviet predecessors once did. The case revealed that the tactics of deep-cover espionage, once the KGB's signature, had not vanished with the Soviet flag. But the most chilling echoes come not from spy rings, but from the fate of those who tried to pull back the curtain. In November 2006, Alexander Litvinenko, a former FSB officer and outspoken critic of Russian security services, died in a London hospital. He had been poisoned with polonium-210, a radioactive substance so rare it could only come from a state laboratory. British investigators traced the trail back to Moscow, but the official denials were swift and absolute. The method, poison, deniability, a message sent, felt familiar to anyone who remembered the old KGB playbook. Other mysteries remain locked away, perhaps forever. After the collapse, vast archives of the KGB disappeared. Some were destroyed in panic. Others were quietly transferred to the vaults of new agencies, their contents classified or simply lost. Researchers and families searching for answers still run into closed doors and missing files. The full story of the KGB's operations, its agents, and its victims may never be known. One figure stands at the center of this unfinished history. Vladimir Putin, once a mid-level KGB officer in Dresden, rose through the ranks of the new security services and into the presidency. Under his rule, former colleagues filled key posts across government and business. The methods, surveillance, secrecy, the careful cultivation of loyalty bear a familiar stamp. The initials on the building may have changed, but the old habits linger. The KGB's legacy is not a relic. It is a living presence, shaping the rules of power and the limits of truth in Russia today. By 1991, the KGB employed over 500,000 officers and answered directly to the Communist Party. Its formal abolition came with a decree in October 1991, but the agency's core functions quickly re-emerged in new Russian institutions like the FSB and SVR. Many personnel stayed in place, and the KGB's archives were partially destroyed or remain classified to this day. In Belarus, the KGB name survived, while Baltic states opened some records to the public. High-profile incidents such as the 2010 sleeper agent arrests in the United States and the 2006 poisoning of Alexander Litvinenko in London highlight the enduring influence of former KGB methods. Despite decades of reforms and new names, much about the KGB's operations, especially its archives and international networks, remains hidden. Today, the legacy of the KGB shapes security policy and political life across the post-Soviet world, leaving a long shadow that fact and document alone cannot fully dispel.